Hey Tribe, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to do a little presentation on something called the Polyvagal theory by Dr. Porges, which I got inspired from Thomas's video today where he was talking about the covering of the face with the mask and how it's impacting our interactions with other people. So hopefully on your screen you're seeing this bell curve that was created by Cheryl Sanders, who's a trauma release exercise provider like I am. And it's a really nice bell curve demonstration of the polyvagal theory. And what this explains is that we have the core vagus nerve that runs from the 10th cranial nerve in our brain down into the viscera in our gut. And it's responsible for our fight, flight, freeze responses. And it serves a function of a sympathetic and a parasympathetic nervous system engagement. But what Porges did was he dissected it a little bit further and found out that the parasympathetic serves two functions. So if you see at the bottom of the chart here, this is the ventral vagal representation of the parasympathetic nervous system. This is when you're going to be going into relaxation. This is where you're curious and happy and you feel love and safety. So you're relaxed, you're able to engage, you're able to have fun. This is when we're like getting into spaces of rest and recuperation. This is where you're getting restorative sleep. You know, when you spend a lot of time with your nervous system in these lower level engagements. And then on the chart, you'll see it kind of pop up into fight and flight. Now this can also be, this is a sort of a, you know, what we call it a negative representation, because I use it when I'm talking to people about trauma. But it can be anything. You don't want to be like in a dreamy love state when you're operating your motor vehicle, right? So you see that little sin wave at the bottom. You're gonna pop up into the I-CAN sympathetic nervous system, so you're paying attention, you know, when you're cooking so you don't burn yourself, or when you're driving your car so you don't get into a wreck. So we're gonna get stimulated up into the sympathetic nervous system, and that can elevate into higher levels of, you know, anger, fear and depression, panic, rage. And then we get into the secondary function, the dorsal vagal function of the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is where the poly, you've got your social engagement calm, you've got your freeze state, you know, completely locked down. And some of the descriptives you can see there are feelings of helplessness and feeling trapped, dissociation, numbness. You know, and we all kind of feel that when we get startled, we have a car wreck, you know, but when you're talking about long-term trauma or early trauma, developmental trauma, you're gonna spend a lot of time in that kind of body collapse, immobility space, and that starts to lead to more of the intense issues there with suicidality and helplessness, learned helplessness, prolonged shame. You know, for me personally, with my past trauma, almost anything could send me into what I called a reptilian brain hijack, like overload of my nervous system. So, you know, an example would be one time I was in a restaurant and a big stack of dishes fell in the back room. It startled everybody, but I went under the table. Like I had a hyper response to stimulus. People would come up from behind me and I'd get, you know, startled. So that made it difficult to function quite often. So on that line there where you see that I can and I can't, there's a sin wave to the right that vacillates up and down. And this is what you'll see with people that have heavy trauma too. Like they do spend more time kind of spaced out and out of their body, because in order to down-regulate down that bell curve back into a social engagement or the lower level sympathetic nervous system responses, you have to feel the intensity of the panic and rage. You can't just jump back down to that. So, and that's where, you know, me as a professional, I provide a service that kind of helps people deal with that intensity and downregulate their nervous systems and learn how to do that for themselves over time. But I'm gonna take a drink. What I was thinking about when Thomas was talking about the mask was specifically the impact that's having on children. And the first time that I had a real clear understanding of that was when early on in the pandemic scare, I took my daughter and I and my granddaughter went to the chiropractor, and she had been going there for years. She was used to the people that worked there, but she walked in and everybody had masks on. So she was sitting on my lap while my daughter was getting adjusted, and her body was just rigid. Like all of her muscles were tense and her eyes were wide, and she was scared. And, you know, the doctor pulled down her mask and smiled at her and, you know, reassured her. But even though she understood that this was somebody that she knew and it was somebody that she was safe, her body was still in this rigid state. And I think a lot of us are going through that. You know, even if you are centered and, you know, you're not buying into all this fear, the impact of how people are behaving takes its toll too. You know, when I go out and I'm dealing with people with a sea of masks on and I don't wear mine, there's repercussions for that. There's psychic repercussions, and your body will respond accordingly, whether you like it to or not. So there's a lot that I could go into with this. If you guys are interested in, you know, learning more about it, let me know. I can do a little bit more in depth. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of explanation about what the body's doing and how it's responding and why it's responding the way it does. And a lot of why so many of us feel exhausted. So many of us feel frustrated and angry. And, you know, it's not just the limitations and the insanity. It's how our body's responding to being in perceived danger, whether it's not being able to see somebody's face or the impact of anger or frustration that you feel when you're being put into a situation to have to do that. You know, and God forbid that it's anybody that has some kind of past trauma where their breathing was impeded or their voice was impeded, like you couldn't speak out to your abuser or whatever. This kind of like being muzzled feeling is going to bring up a lot of this. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them down in the comments. And again, if you're interested, I can go into more detail on this kind of stuff in the future. All right, lots of love, everyone.